Roger Rose, and today we're going to be talking about transitional metaphors and not mixed metaphors. Since metaphors shape thinking, if we conflate mixed metaphors with transitional metaphors, we will likely be one-dimensional in our thinking and fence ourselves off from thinking emergently. I was having a conversation with Dr. Greg Henriquez, who does wonderful work over at the Unified Theory of Knowledge. You can find him at the Stoa, Parallax. He talks, has quite a few wonderful discussions where he talks about his theory, and I suggest giving it a look. I think it is an effort similar to vector theory to fight reductionism and is desperately needed today, given the meaning crisis, given the mental health crisis, so on and so forth. He has some discussions with Mr. Vervaeke as well, and Guy Sinstock, and I had a chance to also to be in a conversation with him over at Voicecraft. So the conversation with him is what inspired this. And again, I want to stress that I think it is important for people to be doing work like Dr. Henriquez because humans don't feel addressed without a theory that makes the universe feel coherent and like it somehow goes together. Humans without that only feel explained, and they can, as a result, feel explained away. And that distinction between explanation and address is critical for O.G. Rose and can be found in Reconstructing A is A, the second book in the trilogy. Metaphors matter. Susan Subtang, Letkov, there's Neil Postman, and I.A. Richards. There's a lot of people who have done work to show that metaphors structure thinking. Metaphors are not merely decorations of thinking. They, in fact, structure thinking. They direct thinking. It's a big deal. So metaphors matter. And there are many pieces in O.G. Rose that discuss the problem of, say, conflating paradox with contradiction, because if you do that, you don't have a category to think what a paradox is, and as a result, you conflate it with contradiction, and you get rid of both. Neither of them matter, which if we follow a Hegel, which if we follow people who share that ontological vision, paradox is a really big deal, and contradiction, as Hegel used it, which is not the same as, say, logical contradiction, but more so like ontological becoming. Well, if you lose those categories, it's going to be very, very difficult to understand Hegel. So likewise, when you use the wrong metaphors, it's very difficult to understand something. Or worse yet, if we use the wrong metaphors by which to understand the universe, our likelihood of understanding the universe is very, very low. We have been trained by English classrooms, and this sounds so funny, to not think in terms of transitional metaphors. We tend to have a knee-jerk reaction against if we see someone use multiple metaphors or to use one metaphor and then start using another metaphors, we tend to have a knee-jerk reaction to say that's a mixed metaphor. And we've been trained to think that a mixed metaphor is wrong and bad, and therefore to dismiss anyone or any thought of which uses mixed metaphor. I think this is really, really a problem, because if indeed there is something to emergence, which is the idea that things can transform it into entirely new ontological schemas or setups or what have you, well then a transition of metaphor to describe the phenomenon would also be necessary. Well, that's a transitional metaphor. That's not the same as a mixed metaphor. But if we only have the category in our head of a mixed metaphor, then we are going to really struggle to think emergence, because any transition we're going to think is a mixture, and mixture is bad, and therefore we kick it out. So, if metaphors are fundamental to thinking, then the loss of the category of transitional metaphors will limit our minds and make us incapable of thinking about certain dimensions of existence. Mainly, emergence is what is being described here. But also, a lot of phenomena in reality cannot be described from a single dimension. I like to be against something I call monotheorism, which is to use a single theory by which to understand reality. And likewise, you usually can't use a mono description by which to really get at something. Like, try to describe a person using one metaphor. I promise you're going to leave out a lot, and you're going to flatten them and make them very one-dimensional. Try to describe a bookcase with a single metaphor if you wanted, or even a single description. How could you do it? You're going to leave a lot out. So whenever we use a single thing, a mono anything, basically, mono explanation, mono description, mono theory, I can go on, it almost has to be reductionist. It tends to be very problematic. That doesn't mean there isn't a place for emphasis on a single theory or emphasis on a single description, but we always have to hold it with an open hand and remember that it is a tool. It is not the thing. It is a map. It is not the territory, and so on and so forth. So similar thing applies to metaphors. We tend to, we will probably get into trouble if we're monometaphoric per se, if we have a single metaphor by which we try to understand, say, war or politics or people or love, or et cetera, we need to have a whole toolkit of metaphors to really get at the thing. So if we're monometaphoric, we're probably going to be in trouble. Well, this is where our knee-jerk tendency to dismiss any multiple use of metaphor is going to get us into trouble. We really need to work on assuming that any multi-use of metaphor is a mixed metaphor, because it's not the case. Now, again, I think if you ask anyone directly, is it okay to use multiple metaphors to describe something, they'll probably say, of course, or yeah. But then when it actually happens, there tends to be a knee-jerk or a subconscious dismissal because we assume it's a mixed metaphor, and mixed metaphors are bad. Now, of course, we should ask, what is a mixed metaphor? And if we follow Webster, it's a figure of speech combining inconsistent or incongruous metaphors. For example, if I say the sun was an eye singing light, I would be speaking as if an eye could sing. That's pretty confusing. What if I were to say, I feel as happy as a lark and as certain as a builder about my day? Though I'm not claiming larks build houses, I am combining in the same sentence the activities of a bird with the crafts of a tradesman, which can be confusing and unclear. How can I be incredibly happy while at the same time stern and focused? So that's a metaphor that's really confusing. And that would be a mixed metaphor. Indeed, mixed metaphors hinder understanding and are bad, and they'll overlay elements which cancel out, and when I say they're bad, they tend to be a problem. Another way to think about it is a mixed metaphor tends to be something, like I said, that hinders understanding. And we can think of Mr. Butler's From Where You Dream, where he talks about a bad sentence kind of breaks up the movie in your head. The sentence needs to flow. So for example, if I say, and imagine I'm a first-person narrator in a story, if I were to say, I opened the door into Mom's living room after walking down the hall. The reason that's not really a good sentence is because I'm standing at the door and then I'm telling you I walked down the hall. So I have to kind of go back in time. It's kind of a jagged sentence. But if I were to instead say, I walked down the hall to Mom's bedroom and opened the door. You see how that kind of flows, right? I mean, it's kind of like it flows from I'm walking down the steps, then I'm at the door, and then I open it. So there's a logic in the sentence. Sure, the first sentence that said I opened the door to Mom's bedroom after walking down the hall. There's nothing grammatically wrong with that. There's nothing... you could use that sentence, but it's not really a good descriptive sentence because it breaks up the movement of the camera per se. So similarly, a mixed metaphor that makes you do a double take, that makes you go, what? You're a lark and a builder. That's not a good metaphor because it's very difficult to figure out how those pieces go together. A good metaphor kind of flows. So indeed, I'm not arguing in this paper that mixed metaphors are good, for indeed it's best to avoid them. But the problem is we tend to go too far and conflate all multiple uses of metaphor with a mixed metaphor. Now, when we come to the topic of emergence, this can be understandable, because basically in emergence, say if physics becomes biology, it's almost like the equivalent of an ant becoming an anthill, of a thing becoming something entirely different, and that's pretty radical and pretty strange, and it does strike us as impossible. But if we follow a vector theory, or we follow Mr. Henrique's work, emergence plays a big role. And if we don't switch metaphors, when there are certain metaphors that will describe an ant, there are certain metaphors that will describe an anthill. But if the ant became the anthill per se, I would need to switch my metaphor. And if I didn't, that would be a problem. But if I switch my metaphor, because I'm talking about something regarding an emergence, this would not be to mix metaphors. This would be to transition in my metaphors, to follow the emergence. Or if I were to be describing about love, how love feels to me, and then I start describing how anger feels to me, or how I carry myself in work, I'm transitioning between different dimensions of which make me me. And there will be different metaphors by which to describe each one of those transitions. It is not the case that I am mixing metaphors necessarily to have transition metaphors. But if we assume that all multiple uses of metaphors is mixing, then we won't be able to, then we're just going to kick all that out. This is very problematic because then what starts happening is you have a subconscious bias against all transitional thinking, all emergence, all moving between metaphors. And that is going to make us very one-dimensional. That's going to make it very difficult for us to think multivariantly about human beings, to consider them in different ways. We're going to get our metaphor, and dang it, we're going to make it fit. We're going to get our map, and we're going to make it equal to territory, and this is going to cause trouble. I mean, you also see with many philosophers today, they're talking about the event language. Bondu, you have Quentin, and after finitude, Bard, and events are these very rare ontological phenomenon that kind of transform the meaning of all ontologies, or just kind of change the meaning of history. They're a big deal. Well, if we're stuck in metaphoric thinking that is monometaphoric, that doesn't let us think about the possibility of events, then we're not going to be able to think about the possibility of events. It's going to be very difficult because metaphors matter. Metaphors structure thinking. And if indeed events and emergences occur in a manner that doesn't fit into a simple box of single metaphoric description, well, then our very inability to entertain multiple metaphors, and also our moralizing of not using multiple metaphors is going to get in the way of our ability to think events, to think emergences, to think multi-dimensions of phenomenon. And so it's really important that we understand there is such thing about transitional metaphors. And again, I mean, you can even talk about, cats are made of atoms, right? I mean, people are made of atoms. The metaphors and ways you would describe atoms is going to be different than how you describe cats. The way you describe biology is different how you're going to describe society or mind. And again, we all know that we don't mix metaphors when we use metaphors to describe mountains that are different from how we describe butterflies. But imagine that somehow a butterfly and a mountain were concentrated into the same point. What will we do then? Relative to this point, would it be possible to avoid mixing metaphors? So if you thought about the beginning of the universe, where all matter is condensed very close together, what would be the right metaphor by which to describe that? Well, it would be very difficult, right? Everything would be combined together. Well, similarly, usually phenomenon in reality are points where there's a lot of potential combined together. There are lots of different ways that things can unfold through time. How do you describe that very potentiality? How do you describe different paths of realized potentiality? All of that is going to require the ability to transition between metaphors, to use a toolbox of different mental models, a toolbox of different metaphors, so that we can follow the transformation and not reduce things to a single dimension, or reduce them to being entities that cannot emerge or cannot undergo events. Because there's very good reason to think events and emergence are possible in the universe. And if the very way we think about the universe is going to be deeply influenced by the kind of way we can think metaphor, the kind of metaphors we think are valid, then we might be cutting ourselves off from a deep and truer understanding of the universe because of a principle we learned in an English classroom. For more by Dr. Henriquez, please see the Unified Theory of Knowledge, the tree that he does. He's got a Medium. He does, like I've noted, Talking with Greg, the great podcast series. Please check it out. And thank you so much for your time.